At that time, I knew I didn't want to be like a full-time orchestral musician. I was really leaning towards the freelance route and being in a major city like New York or LA or Chicago or something like that. And then just kind of, I had other entrepreneurial, ventures in the pipeline, and one I actually went through with, which was the sheet music business. But I just knew, like, probably around like junior year, like, the full-time orchestra and going down that route, I didn't think that was the right route for me, and for others that they felt like that was their right route. And so for me, freelance route and just doing different things seemed more my style and personality there.
Hello and welcome to the Orchestrating Your Career podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca for short, and I'm a clarinetist who studied at the Eastman School of Music and then went to London to get my master's and PhD, both at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. Having shifted pathways in my own life, I love hearing about the varied careers musicians can have and how they got there. And that's precisely what we're exploring in this podcast, as I sit down with music graduates to chat about their unique musical journeys, hear their hard-earned wisdom, and learn about how they're orchestrating their own careers. For today's episode, I had the pleasure of chatting with Jessica Wilkins. Jessica got her undergraduate degree in Oboe Performance from the Eastman School of Music and her master's from the University of Michigan. In the midst of her studies, she started a sheet music business, and after graduating, built up a freelance career in the Los Angeles area. During COVID's lockdown, Jessica discovered just how much she enjoys coding, and she now works full-time as a software developer. In our interview, you'll hear how Jessica has pivoted throughout her journey and how she's incorporated her passions into her life and career. You're listening to Jessica performing a little bit of April Fool for solo English horn. Stay tuned till the end of the episode to hear some more of her playing. And now, let's get right into the interview. Hello, Jessica, and welcome to the Orchestrating Your Career podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We know each other from studying at the Eastman School of Music. We were in the same class, and you were doing oboe there.
Yep.
And then you also had a career after graduating as a professional oboist. But sometime after that, you had a bit of a shift in your career into what you do now, which is working full-time as a computer engineer.
Yeah, software developer, yeah.
Okay, working full-time as a software developer. So I'm super interested to hear just how that pivot happened and more about your experiences to getting to where you are today.
Sure, yeah. It's an interesting story.
I bet. I'm really excited to hear it. But just to start off, could you just share how you first got into classical music and why the oboe?
Yeah, so I grew up in Palm Springs, California. It's about 2 hours south of Los Angeles. I had been interested in music at an early age. I started off in piano at age 7, and I just started taking piano lessons, like beginner piano lessons for like 30 minutes or so, and did like they had like little class recitals and stuff like that. So it was just for fun. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a professional piano player. And so I did that from like 7 years old all the way up until about 18, but then right around like 5th grade, like 10 years old, they had like a little 5th grade band, and it was supposed to be a way to introduce like the basics of like woodwind instruments and brass instruments to help with the feeder programs in the middle schools. And so we would meet once a week, and we basically had to choose like 5 instruments, and it was like flute, clarinet, saxophone, like all the popular ones. And so I picked trumpet, and I like hated it, and I was like really bad at it. Like I couldn't like fuzz or anything like that. So I was like really bad at it, but like, I mean, we were 10, so we were all like, not the greatest. Yeah. But I like really didn't like it. But I really wanted to be in band with my friends next year. And so my mom was teaching at the middle school that I used to be at. And so she talked to the band director, and she's like, hey, my daughter, she's playing piano. She's playing trumpet right now, but doesn't really like it. Is there another instrument she can play for 6th grade band? He met with me after class and said like, oh, do you want to play oboe? And I was like, I don't know what that is. And so he like went and got an oboe and like put it together for me and got a reed, and then like showed me how to make the embouchure. And he was like, okay, take a deep breath and blow. And I made some sort of sound, and he was like, okay, great, you can be our new oboe player. And I was like, okay. And so he gave me the number of like this lady that lived locally that gave like beginner lessons. And so everything kind of like fell into place. And so I kind of just like fell into oboe. And my first teacher was like super nice. She taught like elementary music as as well. And so she kind of, her excitement about the oboe, like helped me get excited about it. And she like gave me all these recordings to listen to. And that's when I started like really getting more into it. And then once I got into high school, I was like, well, maybe I want to like do this professionally. And so that's when I had switched teachers to Fred Corman, who was out. He had just come from Oregon, playing with the principal oboe with Oregon Symphony. And so that was like a huge shift because he really helped prepare me for like, this is what you need to do to like, you know, get ready for undergrad and stuff like that, and introduced me to that whole world and the teachers to look out for. And that's where like Eastman popped up for the first time. And so I started doing like music camps, like at Idlewild summer music camp and stuff like that. Yeah, I had done that a few times. I did like one of their symphonic band sessions and their symphonic like orchestra sessions a couple of times in the summers. And so that's where things like started to kind of click. And I was like, maybe I really want to do this. So I started like really thinking seriously about it, preparing for that. And then that's when I applied for Eastman. And it's interesting because I never actually auditioned in person.
Oh, wow.
And so, because like I couldn't get out there for
Yes,
the in
it's
person.
far for you.
It's far from like California to Rochester. And so they had regional auditions, and one of the regional ones was in Los Angeles. And so that's when we did like a regional one. And the teacher there, Mr. Kilmer, he wasn't there at the audition. They just had like a video camera and someone from admissions like manned the video camera and like manned the auditions. And so I was super bummed because like I wanted to meet Mr. Kilmer because like I kept hearing over and over again like how amazing he was. Yeah. And I knew like how difficult it was to like get into that studio. So I was like, oh man, I really just wanted to meet him. I wasn't sure if I was gonna like get in and stuff. And so I auditioned, and then I heard back that I like got in. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Wow. And so it was just like a whirlwind experience. So that's kind of my journey like into Eastman, which is where we met. So.
Yes, that's so interesting because I think just the experience that you've had auditioning regionally, I think is a little bit different than most. I think most people do try to go visit the school, especially like you were saying, to meet the teacher. Were you auditioning for a bunch of other schools? Did you do any other college visits, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I ended up auditioning, I believe it was a total of 6 schools, if I remember correctly. And so Northwestern was one of them, Eastman, Arizona State University, University of Las Vegas, USC, Southern California. And so those were the schools that I ended up going to. And so some of them I was able to take lessons to, obviously the ones closer to me, like USC, ASU, and Vegas there. But unfortunately for Northwestern as well, I wasn't able to like get out there and take a lesson and stuff because my mom was a single mom, and so she couldn't always like take off a whole bunch of work to like go to Northwestern and Illinois, and definitely to Rochester for Eastman. And so the timing just didn't work out to like go and take a lesson and stuff like that. And then even to go do a live audition. So luckily I was able to do regional auditions in Los Angeles, but I never actually met the Northwestern oboe teacher like in person. And the first time I met Mr. Kilmer was like when I showed up for orientation. So
How did your decision process work out then in deciding to go to Eastman, given that you'd never even been there, you hadn't met the teacher? What made you decide you still wanted to go study 4 years at the school?
Yeah, that was an interesting situation because like I had gone through the auditions, and auditions are typically like in February and stuff like that in January. And then I started hearing back from like school after school. And so the first one I was accepted to was University of Las Vegas with Stephen Kaplan as the oboe professor. And I was like, okay, cool. Like I really liked him, and we vibed and stuff. And then it was like rejection after rejection after rejection. And so I was like, okay, I guess like I'm going here. And at that point I was like, well, that's cool because I like vibed with the professor. And so I just assumed like I wasn't going to get into Eastman because I had like received all these rejections like back to back. And then so I was actually in after school calculus tutoring because I was kind of like struggling with calculus. And so as like extra credit to help bring up my grade, I went to after school tutoring. And I remember I was bored because I just didn't understand calculus at all. And so then that's when I like checked my phone, and that's when I got a message on my phone. It's from admissions, and they're like, congratulations, you got into Eastman. I was like,
oh my gosh.
What? And I remember having to like play it back, like, did they call the right person? And then so I remember like leaving calculus tutoring, which in hindsight was probably not the best idea because I said I was going to be there for extra credit, but I was just like, forget it, I'm going to Eastman. And so I like left and went to the band room. I remember telling like my band director and my band friends, they're like, oh, that's so cool, you got into Eastman. I was like, oh no, it's crazy. So yeah.
You just knew.
I did, yeah. And I was like, I really want to go there. And then in like finances came up and I was like, well, how is this going to work out? But luckily, like through the combination of like student loans and like scholarships and then my mom helping out, we were able to like make it work. So it was good though. So,
yeah, that's cool. I love those stories of finding out news like that. I think it's so funny, like how you can remember exactly where you were, that it was calculus class and everything, because it's such a pivotal moment in your life.
Yeah, and because like I said, like I remember just getting like rejection after rejection. I'm like, okay, well, I was just like expecting like to be like, oh, sorry, we regret to inform you. I was like expecting that from like Eastman after like 3 rejections in a row from the other schools, and so to get the phone call, I was like, what?
Yeah,
that's crazy. So cool.
Amazing. How was your experience then? Moving into the dorms at Eastman, studying at Eastman, especially given that you're coming from the West Coast, it's quite different. Even just the weather is very different, California versus Rochester.
Yeah.
So how was that transition period and adjusting to moving to Rochester?
Yeah, like my like move-in day, because we got in I think like a day or two before because we had never been to Rochester before, whereas like everybody else like had actually been there like audition day and stuff. And so we got there a couple of days. I remember like I think we went to the George Eastman house and like just kind of
cool.
went around sightseeing and stuff. But yeah. And then we were staying at some sort of hotel. Maybe it was like a Radisson downtown. And then the day that orientation started, the move-in day and all that stuff, I remember it was like chaos because you had all those great big blue bins and stuff like that. And so we were moving in, and my roommate was actually from China, so she wasn't there yet.
Oh, wow.
And so she came, I think, like a day or two later. So I had the room to myself, like in the first day. But then of course, you go through that whole orientation, and that's when I finally met Mr. Kilmer. I went up to the second floor. And I went down to his room, and then I just heard this like great big booming voice of like, "Oh, that's Jessica Wilkins." I was like, "Oh yeah, that's so cool." And so like to meet him in the first because he had called when I got accepted, and we talked for like an hour, and then and he was telling me like everything that was going to happen freshman year, and he was so excited. And he was telling me about the other freshmen oboists that were coming in, and so yeah, it was just like meeting him in person for the first time. It was really cool and like surreal to be here. And so the first time I'm walking through, Eastman, and at the time they were still working on Eastman Theater, so I didn't even like get to see the theater until that opening like fall concert where they performed Shostakovich 5. And so it was kind of like this whirlwind experience, and they're of course throwing all this information your way. And then I remember there was that moment where my mom's like, okay, well, I'm gonna take off. Yeah, exactly. And I was like, okay, bye.
Yeah.
And so it was just like awkward because it was just like me, like, by myself in the room. And then I think there was some sort of maybe oboe dinner or something like that. And I think the next person I met was like Danny, and Danny, of course, has this Danny Cruz is like this big personality. And so yeah, it was like this whirlwind experience those first few days, but it was great to kind of like settle in and get started there.
Yeah. And it's really cool to hear about just that experience of doing it without any prior connection to Rochester or having been able to visit it. Because I was able to visit Eastman for my audition, and that really was what helped solidify, this was the place I wanted to go. But you didn't have the luxury of being able to do that. But I know when I applied overseas to London, it was similar. Like I did a regional audition because I couldn't fly out there.
Right.
And then I went over there having never been to London before, having never met the teacher before. And so I can relate to some of your experiences of just that whirlwind of adjusting to a whole new place. And also like flying from the West Coast to the East Coast because I flew from the East Coast to get here to California to be here. And it's a similar flight as like flying to London, and it's a whole different world.
Yeah.
The different coast. So yeah, it's just really interesting to hear about that kind of experience. What was it like studying at Eastman, studying with Mr. Kilmer? What was that time period like for those 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, it was like crazy to like meet all the different oboists and like, because I think for a lot of oboists, like usually it's like one or two at our like high school and middle school experience. So now to be in a completely different environment, and we were in a larger studio. I think there was total of like 18 or 19 of us at any given time in the studio between like undergrads and grad students. And so it was crazy to be around that many like oboists and to get to learn from them. But everybody was so supportive of each other, and we just wanted to like watch each other grow. And the four of us that were in the freshman class, the two Amy's and Danny and myself, and we have very different personalities, but we all like complimented each other. And so there was like a lot of bonding going on there. And then of course, like Mr. Kilmer, like leading the pack there. And he just was super passionate about teaching. I mean, he's still teaching to this day. And I think he's at what, 40 years or something, or almost to 40 years of teaching at Eastman alone. And so just his like energetic, like, and excitement about the oboe. And he would go to like every single concert and give us feedback. I remember he would like come down and be like, yeah, this was great. And this is what we need to keep working on and stuff like that. And so it just made you want to be more excited about it, because he just has this like infectious energy and just loves all things oboe. And so you can't help but like not want to replicate that. And so it was a really positive experience, because I had other friends in like other studios that had completely different experiences where it was like more cutthroat and stuff like that. So I was really fortunate not to have that type of experience within the oboe studio, where everybody's like really supportive and we just want everybody to win and reach their goals there.
Yeah, amazing. Did you know while you were at Eastman that you would always go on to do a master's? Were you thinking about what was the next step after graduating?
Yeah, so when it came to like senior year, I think all four of us, quite frankly, like, because other classes, they knew for sure I'm going to get a master's or I'm going to get a doctorate or I'm going to go straight and start auditioning for orchestras. And I think our class was interesting because well, I know like Danny was doing an extra semester because he was student teaching and stuff like that. And so was Amy Schersath, and she was doing other things as well. And so the other Amy, Lou Green, and myself, we were like, okay, are we going to do a master's? And like, I think a lot of us were in that same boat of like, I guess so. Maybe that's what we're supposed to do. Maybe. And so I think a lot of us just decided to audition for a smaller amount of schools. And so I only auditioned for 3. And I just told myself, like, if I don't get into like these 3, and if the finances don't work out, then I'm just not going to go. I'm not going to like force it, and which was a very different thing than like undergrad. And so that's kind of how I went into it. And so I was very selective and picked the 3 schools that I knew like the teachers pretty well. And so one of them was University of Michigan with Nancy Ambrose King as the oboe professor. And since it was closer, I think it was like a 7-hour drive, because at that point I had a car, and so I was able to drive from Rochester to Michigan and take a lesson with her and kind of walk around the school and listen to one of the rehearsals and stuff like that. And I just like bonded with her instantly. And she has like a similar like bubbly personality and big personality, and is an incredible player and teacher. And I was like, oh man, I'd really love to like study with her. And so that was like my number 1 school that I really wanted to go to. And I really enjoyed the other school. Like I went to SMU and UT Austin there, but like Michigan was like the one that I really wanted to go to. But I just told myself, if I don't get into any 3, and if the finances don't really work out, then I'm not going to force it. I'm just going to figure out what my next move is. And I think at that age, when like at that time I was like 21, so typically at that age you can kind of float around and just kind of figure out what's next, and you're not really tied down to anything. So that was like my mindset at the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting also just how you're pulling out the different experiences of applying for undergrad versus postgrad, and how, you know, this time you're able to go visit, really get a feel for the school, but also you just had a different mindset going into it, which I think makes a lot of sense. I feel like that pivot period from undergrad to postgrad is I think a lot of people put out a lot of feelers, and you just sort of see what happens and what works out. Other people can have a very direct, you know, this is my plan, this is what I want to happen, but I resonate a lot with just putting out a lot of different feelers.
Yeah, just kind of seeing what happens.
Yeah.
And I knew for sure, like, I was going to stop at a master's. I wasn't going to keep going and get a doctorate there because I wasn't interested in teaching at the collegiate level there and at that capacity. So.
Yeah. What were your thoughts about what you wanted to do with oboe at that time?
At that time, I knew I didn't want to be like a full-time orchestral musician. I was really leaning towards the freelance route and being in a major city like New York or LA or Chicago or something like that. And then just kind of, I had other entrepreneurial, ventures in the pipeline, and one I actually went through with, which was the sheet music business. But I just knew, like, probably around like junior year, like, the full-time orchestra and going down that route, I didn't think that was the right route for me. And for others, that they felt like that was their right route. And so for me, freelance route and just doing different things seemed more my style and personality there.
Was there anything in your experience at Eastman that helped shape that mindset? Because when you entered Eastman, did you have a different idea of what your career would look like? Did it shift at all?
Yeah, I think when I initially went in, I just assumed I was going to like pursue the full-time orchestral path. And then as I started to explore other options and then also participating in the arts leadership program, that had a heavy influence because it opened my mind to like different possibilities.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, maybe I could be part of like a chamber ensemble. Maybe I could do freelance. And so that's when I started moving away from the more, I guess, traditional route of going and being like a full-time orchestral musician. And so that's why I wanted to pursue like freelance and do that kind of route instead.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also was part of the arts leadership program, and I remember just that realization of, there are a lot of different things you can do with a music degree. It doesn't have to be an orchestral pathway. Right. And I remember, they would bring in chamber ensembles and giving workshops and things and thinking, that's a potential pathway.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it was nice that where it just opened, because I think a lot of us went in with like, this is what you're supposed to do. And then we ended up leaving like, we could do this or this and this. And so,
When you were talking about some of these other entrepreneurial ideas, when did you start your sheet music business? Was that at Eastman or in your master's? And how did that come about?
Yeah. So ever since I was like pretty much in like high school, I would always just do like little arrangements and stuff like that. And so my friends and I would just form like random chamber groups. And so, but it would never be like the traditional like woodwind quintet or stuff like that. And so it was just whoever wanted to play together. So it would be like flute, oboe, horn, saxophone, like random instrumentation. And obviously there's not a lot of music for that mixed ensemble. And we didn't obviously have money because we were like 14 years old, 15 years old. And so even if there was loud music for like random, mixed chamber ensembles. And so that's when I would take my old piano books and then I would just go through and I taught myself how to arrange and transpose. And I was like, okay, in this key, it's got to, I got to transpose it in this key and stuff like that. I taught myself how to work finale music notation. And we would just kind of play around and do little small chamber groups. And that's when I got the fever or the bug to like arrange and stuff like that. So I just kept doing that. And I remember I wrote a couple of, when I got to Eastman, I wrote a couple of like oboe quartets, and I wrote one that I would transcribe from Robert Schumann. It was this like piano piece. It was a fugue. And I remember we were just reading it and we weren't planning to like perform it anywhere. It was just the freshman oboe class and all four of us just reading through it. And we were in Mr. Kilmer's office because he always gave us like keys and stuff to use his office. And so I remember he like came in and he was like, "What are you guys playing?" I was like, I just kind of arranged this. And he's like, "Oh, that sounds great. Like, can I hear it?" I was like, "Sure." And so like we like ran through it because it was like this short little piece. He's like, "Oh, that's really cool. How many of these do you have?" I was like, "I don't know, like 80." And he's like, "Oh my gosh, okay." And so he like started nicknaming me like Dr. Wilkins and stuff like that. And because like he wasn't expecting that answer. And I was just like, "I don't know, I just do it for fun." And so I kept like toying around with the idea. I was like, "I don't know, maybe I'll start a website and like sell it and stuff." And I kept like saying that. And then that's when my friend Danny was just like, "Oh, when are you gonna start the website?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know what I'm doing." He's like, "Well, I just started," And he was right. And like I kept like waiting for this like moment and saying like, "Oh, I didn't know any like business stuff," but he was right. He's like, "Just start it and figure it out. You're young, you'll figure it out along the way." And so that's when I started. I launched it right after I graduated from Eastman before I started my master's, and I launched it that summer. It was actually the first day of the International Double Reed Society conference, and that year it was held in Redlands, which is not too far from where we're at, where we're recording here. It's about an hour or so away from LA. I remember that first day, the night before, I was like emailing a whole bunch of people, like, hey, I just started this new, sheet music. Could you just like share it with people or whatever? And so I like launched the website, and I was just like emailing people on like Facebook and stuff like that. And they're like, oh, this is so cool. Yeah, I'll share it and stuff. And I didn't know if I was going to get like any, orders and stuff. And the first order was actually from Nancy Ambrose King from Michigan. So that's how it like all got started there.
That's so interesting that you were even doing that in high school. I think that's quite early to be arranging. And then you were saying you basically taught yourself all of these different skills. Could you dig a little more into what that means, how you taught yourself these different skills and how you... Was it intuition? What were you pulling on for that?
Yeah. So when it came time to writing for like different instruments, I wasn't sure like of the different like transpositions where I was like, okay, well, if we have a saxophone, what do I need to write it in so it could like work within the group and stuff? And so I would just take like a saxophone piece, and then I would take like an oboe piece and like compare the key signatures. And I was like, oh, okay, so I need to write it like this. And I just kind of went through like trial and error and learning like the different like transpositions and stuff, like, oh, they're in this key, so I've got to do this. And then I just kind of was experimenting with like my friends and be like, hey, can we play this and can we play that, and learning kind of what works for the instruments and what doesn't work. I was pretty comfortable with what worked for oboe, but like for like clarinet and stuff, or flute or saxophone or horn, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't write that for horn. Maybe that's a little bit too hard for horn, or at least at the intermediate level, or maybe like this would sound better in this range. So I kind of was just experimentation. I never did any like formal classes at that point. And then in terms of like Finale, at the time they had this like free version. Unfortunately they don't have that free version anymore, but like they had this like free version which was like super basic, but it was enough to like get started and play around with like smaller chamber ensembles. And so I was fortunate to use their free version to like learn how to start using notation software. And then once I got into Eastman in the computer lab, they had like the actual Finale. I remember the first time I used that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is
so
like,
much more.
It's so much more, because like the free version, I think you're limited to like 4 or 5 like instruments. And then I got to like Eastman, and then the computer lab, they had like the full like actual one. I'm like, oh my gosh, I could write a whole symphony here. So it was really cool.
So when you were then moving on to masters, you had just launched this new venture. How did you balance that with your masters? What did starting this new business look like alongside your master's studies?
Yeah. So the first 2 years were more so of like a hobby, and I would make like a little bit of money here and there, but I wasn't like full time with it. And so I just had it like kind of up and running. I was just experimenting with like what people were interested in, but I kind of just had it off to the side because I wanted to put all of my energy into the master's. And my master's was very different from undergrad, where undergrad was like, especially those first couple of years, you take all those theory classes and history classes, all that stuff. And then the master's was like all performance based. Like I think I took like one humanities class or something per semester. It was like a couple of like music history classes because I placed out of the music theory stuff. And so it was pretty chill in terms of like the academic requirements. It was more so about performance. I was part of the conducting workshop for both the orchestra and the band, and that's where the graduate students would practice like their conducting in smaller chamber ensembles. So that was a paid opportunity for the musicians part of that. So that was kind of cool. And then I did like a bunch of gigs around like the Detroit area, because the Ann Arbor is not that far from Detroit, and I had a car, so it kind of like worked itself out. And then I kind of like lucked up in terms of teaching, because I didn't know I was going to get any teaching students, but I had a hard time like finding a place to live around when I was like looking around initially, and I just couldn't find like the right place. And then I found this place. There's this little town called Belleville, Michigan, and it's like 20 or so minutes minutes away from Ann Arbor. It was this like cute little town, and they had these like cute little apartments that were like greatly. I think I paid like $700 a month or something for like this nice little 1-bedroom, and I was like, this is awesome, coming, especially coming from like California.
Yeah, seriously.
And so I was like, this is awesome. I like lucked up, and so I found this great little apartment, lived there for 2 years while I was studying at Michigan, and it just turned out they were looking for an oboe teacher at their schools, at both the middle school and the high school. So
Amazing.
I like fell into all these students, and I was like, oh wow, because I told Dr. King, my teacher, like, hey, I found a place in Belleville, and she's like, oh my gosh, it's crazy. They've been asking me about an oboe student, but no one goes out there, and you live out there. I'm like, okay. And so like I ran into all these like gigs and opportunities, so it was pretty cool. So most of my like master's was just performing and like gigging around and actually making a little bit of a living. So it was kind of cool.
Yeah, really. It sounds like a lot of the pieces of what makes up a freelance oboist career, you were already doing those at the master's level.
Yeah.
How did you balance all of those things alongside the coursework of a full-time master's program?
Yeah, I kind of looked up because like I think I was taking maybe at max like 9 credits, and like the only like I guess academic course I had was like a music history course per semester, and it differed from like undergrad where you had to take a specific music history. Here it's like you can just pick whatever, and so I picked like Debussy courses and stuff like that, and like courses that I was interested in, and so the coursework wasn't really that like daunting or anything like that. It was very different than like undergrad where it's like you've got to start with Gregorian chant and like go through like Baroque and all that other stuff. Here you can just kind of pick and choose which classes, and so I think that made it more fun and engaging, and a lot of it was like writing papers and stuff, so it wasn't like a whole bunch of like reading and stuff. It was a lot of discussions, and then sometimes it was some readings and then writing papers, and so luckily the coursework was like very minimal, and then of course there was like the orchestral rotations and stuff like that, and the band rotations. So most of the time I think almost all the time I spent in the symphonic band with Michael Haythcock when he was still there. So yeah.
So then when you finished your master's and transitioning into a full-time career, was it a pretty smooth transition because you had already all of these pieces going? What was that time period like?
Yeah, that was interesting because like the master's, it seemed to just fly by. Like 1 minute I was like just moving in, the next minute it's like, okay, I'm graduating.
It's 2 year course?
2 years, yeah, 2 years for the master's. And so it was very different than undergrad where it seemed to take on a little bit longer. So once I was done, I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in Michigan because I did have all this stuff going on, but then I didn't really love the weather. And then my mom's like, well, maybe you want to move back to California and try your hand in Los Angeles. And I kept going back and forth. And I was like, I'll take the leap because I'm now 23 and it's like, I'm not tied down to anything. Like, let's just give it a try. And so I left something that was pretty secure. Like I could have stayed out there and built it up. I got more teaching gigs and opportunities. And obviously the cost of living is very different out there. I did end up picking up everything. And like, I literally drove from Michigan to Los Angeles with all my stuff. So I remember like packing up my apartment and just dumping everything that I wanted to actually keep in my in my car and just loading up the car and then just driving. And so it took a few days to go from like Michigan back to like Los Angeles. And I was staying with my grandmother at the time. So I had a little bit of savings, but then it was just starting from zero because I didn't really know anybody out there. And so I just started kind of networking and getting to know the different contractors and different opportunities and where I could start playing so people can like hear me and stuff. And so the first few years it was just like a little sporadic. And so I had other jobs to kind of like fill in the income and stuff like that. And then at that point I started trying to like build up more of the sheet music and experimenting with like what are people looking for. And that's when I hit on like the music education market and started creating more methods books. And that's where in terms of the sheet music things started taking off. And then right around like I guess like late 2017, early 2018, that's where I had enough from not only the sheet music but then from the performances because so so that was like a 3-year period from like 2015 to 2018, just like building up my reputation and building connections. And that's when I was able to finally make like a full living. So it took like a good 3 years to like build up to that point and actually make a living, especially in Los Angeles. But I like lucked up there and just like kept grinding it out and stuff like that. And so it was a lot of hours, but I mean, at that time I was like, early 20s. So working all the time. Like I don't advise like people just like work all the time, but
for a season,
especially since I was like, I don't know if I could do that same schedule today in my 30s, but like back then I was just like, yeah, that works. So yeah.
I really love how you just went for it. You just decided to move to LA, and you were saying you left something really secure, and you had spent 2 years in Michigan building up a really pretty rich freelance kind of life. Could you talk a little bit more about that process of deciding to leave that behind and what really prompted you to make the move to LA?
Yeah. I was like, it took a while to kind of, because I kept going back and forth. I was like, I got a lot of stuff here. I've got like teaching here. I could get more teaching there. I could like build up. And so I wasn't really sure, but I just thought, you know what? Let's just take the chance. Let's take the leap. And I always told myself, like, if LA really just doesn't work out and it just crashes and burns, then I could just pick up and move elsewhere. And so that was always in the back of my mind of like, I could just figure something else out and move elsewhere. And so I just decided, you know what? Let's just go for it. I have no clue how it's gonna work out. Either it works out or it just like crashes and burns. And I think too, I think things would have been different if I like had kids and stuff or I had other responsibilities. But being like a young 20-something-year-old, not really tied down to anything, I could just pick up and move and be like, let's just try this. It made it a little bit easier to kind of just take the risk there.
How did you begin building up your life in LA? You're saying it took a 3-year period to really build up the contacts, build up the work. What did that period look like? And what were your first steps in starting that process?
Yeah, once I landed in California, I actually spent a month in Palm Springs because my mom was still living out there. And so I was doing a little bit of teaching and just kind of doing a couple of workshops once I got back. And then I moved to Los Angeles and I didn't know like anybody. And so I started just like literally Googling around like and found like different communities of like, oh, here are the different contractors. And so a lot of the big contractors that I ended up working with later on, initially, like they just like ghosted me. And so like I was trying to reach out through like email and messages and stuff like that. And, like I didn't really hear anything back. And I was like, okay, I gotta like meet people in person. And so I found that there was a lot of like semi-professional like music groups out there that were looking for oboists. And so I started just auditioning for them. And so the first few auditions didn't quite work out, but then I found a group out in Los Angeles, out in the Valley, and they were had openings. And so even though that wasn't a paid group, it was an interesting group. It's called the LA Winds. They've now been around, I guess, 40 years or something like that. But at the time, it still wasn't a paid group, but it was an interesting mixture of like amateur musicians that kind of play for fun, and then also woodwind doublers that and also band directors that just wanted to keep playing. And so you had like a mix of like half professional musicians that were just wanted to keep up, especially a lot of the woodwind doublers, they were playing like the other instruments to kind of beef that side up. And then also you had like band directors that were playing in that group, and then also just like, dentists and stuff like that. So it was a nice like eclectic group of people. And so I decided to like reach out and be like, hey, I saw that you guys have like openings. Can I audition? They're like, yeah, come on down and just bring something to play. And so that first rehearsal, I like drove down. It was like a Monday night at 7 p.m. or something like that. And I remember that the oboist, I think he had like dental surgery or something. And so like their principal oboist like couldn't really play. And I remember there was another woman there that was just kind of like a casual player, and I think someone else, and then like myself. And so he was like, oh, well, tell me about yourself. And then I was like, oh yeah, I just like graduated here and here. And he's like, oh, okay, well, do you want to just play the first part? I'm like, okay. And so I think we were playing like Rhapsody in Blue or something like that. And so there were some times where there was like solos that I got to play, and people were like, oh, okay, that's
Pretty
nice.
good.
Yeah. And so that's when like people started like getting to like hear me. So then at that point we were both like switching off between principal, and I was like, oh, do you still want me to audition? He's like, no, you just kind of did, you know. I was like, okay, cool. And so kind of from there I started just connecting with the other like professional musicians in that group. And then interesting enough, like one of the people that I was trying to reach out to, Anthony Parther, I wasn't able to get a hold of. And then one of my friends that I had met through that group, his name was Vincent, who had fortunately passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a flute player, and he was like, hey, I'm going to put you in contact with some people because I really like your playing style. I was like, yeah, that's great, thank you. And so we exchanged business cards, and that's when I heard from Anthony Parther, who's a bassoonist out here and a conductor. And so he was like, hey, we are doing our new season for the Southeast Symphony, and we can use another oboe player, and here's how much it pays. Do you want to come out? And I was like, yeah, that would be so cool. And then that's how I just started just jumping around to different groups. And so yeah, so it just started though with like I need to get out there and like play with people, and like they need to like hear me. So yeah, so that was the long part, was just like I need people to like hear me.
Yeah. And then once you were able to make that first connection, it sounds like you were then really able to branch off of that and make more and build off of that.
Right. Yeah, and I think consistency is like key, especially out in a large city like this, because contractors want to know like what they're hiring for and stuff like that, and that if they hire you for a gig, that like you're going to consistently show up and every single time and deliver like you did the last time. And so that was the big thing. Just like every single time I got a gig, I was just like, okay, I'm all in, and just making sure I have all the right reads and the good reads and like all that stuff. And so.
And how were you building up your sheet music business as well during that time?
Yeah, so the early days, I was focused mainly on like small chamber ensembles, and then I found out that like a lot of the sales were coming from the duets and trios, and so I shifted more of my energy. I just started creating a whole bunch of duets and trios, not so much as quartets and quintets and stuff. And then I found out a lot of like independent, like private lesson teachers were using that, and so that's when I started going after that market, because that was where most of the money was coming from. And then I was like, oh, I got to get like other people selling my stuff. And so I like reached out to some smaller other retailers, but then they were like, oh, I'm not really interested. And I was like, I got to get like a big fish. And so that's when I reached out. I started like studying J.W. Pepper's catalog, and I was like, oh, well, maybe like some of these duets that we have could work really well in their catalog. So I reached out to them, and they were like, yeah, this would work out. And so I was able to like get them to distribute my music and set up like a wholesale situation. So once they were on board, then like the others started coming on board, because then I could reach back out and be like, well, I really want to expand because I'm working with J.W. Pepper. And they're like, oh, okay, And so like that's how I was able to like start building it out and have other people like sell it, not just on my end. And that's where things really started to turn into an actual business. So the first few years were like more so like a hobby while I was trying to like figure things out. And then that's when it really, once I figured out like, oh, the music education market, especially private lesson teachers, that's where I got to go. That's when it like finally turned into like an actual business. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And that's when I started doing like conferences and stuff like that. And so I would like drive to conferences if they were drivable, or even hop in a plane and go do like, an IDRS conference or something like that. And so, yeah.
And at these conferences, you were talking about your sheet music, or what was
I would have like an exhibitor, at the tables and
selling.
Stuff like that. Yeah. So it was a very different experience than when I was a student and just going to like, and so I was just me at the table. Sometimes I have friends if it was like in California and stuff like that, but if I had to like go elsewhere. So I went like in Arizona and Oklahoma, parts of California, and then whenever there was an IDRS that I could actually get there, the Double Reed Society. I also did one of the horn societies as well, and horn people are really cool. So I like that one because that was in LA, so I was able to do that. And I did a few IDRS conferences that were, I never did any of the international ones, but anytime it was in the States, I would fly out and buy the tables and set everything up. And it was a very different experience there.
And to get those, were you emailing and asking to be part of it, or were people getting in touch with you?
For the exhibitors?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the exhibitors, they'll open up the application and they'll say, like, here's how much it is per table. And
Gotcha.
I got a little sticker shock the first time.
I bet.
Because I wasn't used to spending, like, thousands of dollars just to, like, be out there.
Yeah.
And that was very different than when I was, like, a student where it's
Yes.
like, oh, you just pay, you know? And so, like, you just pay this little amount. And so I was like, oh, my gosh, now I'm, like, an adult and stuff. And I got to pay for the tables and all this other stuff and shipping stuff. And so it was kind of crazy. But it was great to, like, network and meet the other retailers. I started building up relationships with, like, Forest Music. And I'm still friends with Cynthia, who runs Forest Music today, and RDG Woodwinds and the other retailers. And so it was great to kind of learn from them, too, because they had been in business way longer than I had. So I was able to kind of study, like, oh, this is what they're doing. This next year, we should be doing this, too. And so it was great learning experience to be able to, like, grow with them there.
And were you the only one working on your business, or at some point did you start bringing in other help?
Yeah, at this point, it was still just like me. I was like a solopreneur. I was just like all in. And so I was like working all the time. And then, it was kind of crazy. I probably should have. I mean, I could have at like one point like brought in maybe like a college kid or something to kind of help out. But I was just like, I'm going to do it all and all that stuff. And so,
What were all the then different pieces of what was involved with your sheet music company?
And so we had like the main site, which is still up to this day, and it's jdwsheetmusic.com. And then at the time we had like other retailers. So we had JW Pepper, Forest Music, selling our stuff, as well as some others. And then we also were doing like conferences and stuff like that, where I would just go around and also I was able to get some like teaching opportunities. I taught at the Vocal Majority camp, and then I would do a couple like commissions and stuff like that because they were always looking for double reed pieces and larger. And then I started doing like other like double reed or mixed chamber ensembles for different groups, and so that was part of the business as well. So it was kind of income streams coming from like different places.
Well, because there's this whole business side to that, but there's also just the practical side of your, creating these arrangements, writing them, formatting them, all of that. How did you find the time to do all of that alongside building up a whole freelance career?
Yeah, I was working a lot is the answer to that. If I had to look back, I was probably doing like 70, 80 hours a week, which is probably not like the best, but I think, at the time it kind of worked out, and I was doing what I loved and stuff like that. And so I was just like, oh yeah, this is awesome there. But I did have to learn how to like take breaks and make sure to take time off and whatnot. And so I would travel with my mom and stuff like that. And so I had to learn how to balance a little bit more so I didn't burn out. But I was just kind of just the Energizer Bunny. Just kind of kept going there.
So you were able over those few years to build up the sheet music business and then your freelance career in LA. So could you also just break down what all the different pieces of that freelance career looked like?
Yeah, so it was mainly like there was the performance aspect of it. So I would do like recording sessions. And then I would do like towards the end, I did like a lot of small opera, independent opera companies and playing for that. And so that was like a different experience. And then occasionally musicals, because a lot of musicals are for like woodwind doublers, which I wasn't. So they didn't have like a lot of musicals that were just like oboe and English horn. But the few times that those gigs did open up, those were fun to do. Then also just like random like orchestra gigs and stuff like that, and Easter gigs and like the summer gigs where you have the Pops concerts and stuff like those were fun. And then Christmas time was always crazy busy, but in a good way. But those were always fun, doing Nutcrackers and Messiahs and stuff like that. So that was the performance aspect of it. And then the teaching aspect of it, I got my first teaching job. I had actually taught out at Vocal Majority, and they had it out at Pepperdine, and one of the other oboe teachers was leaving her teaching position at Burbank Unified, and so she recommended me. She's like, oh, you should look into Jessica. I just literally finished teaching with her, and so that's when I was able to start teaching out in Burbank Unified and as a double reed instructor, and so just teaching in the different schools, and I had like a small little private studio as well. So that was like the freelance portion there.
So teaching, performing gigs, and then sheet music business, and that was all the different pieces that sort of made up your career. Okay. So for the gigging part, how did you get involved in the different scenes of, breaking into musicals, breaking into recording studios? Was that just through different contexts?
Yeah, like this was like heavy like networking.
Yeah.
And so like once I started playing with a group of musicians and getting to know them, then they were like, oh, hey, my friend's starting up an opera company and we need an oboist. Are you free? Or, oh, hey, we've got this recording session for this artist. Are you free? And so a lot of it just kind of came from that, which it's a networking plays like a major role. And you just have to like get out there and like show what you can do and, have your business card ready and pass it along. And people will reach out to you and be like, oh, I heard about you from so-and-so. And it's like, oh, cool, But so it takes a while. It's not like something that happens like, over a weekend, But once you're like consistent with that and then it starts to build up and you can build a name and a reputation there. So.
After spending all of that time and effort building up your freelance professional oboist career, you then shifted into software engineering. How did that happen, and how did you make that transition?
Yeah, that was kind of like a left turn. Yeah. Leading up into the pandemic, it was kind of crazy because I was like full steam ahead. I remember I was getting ready for IDRS 2020 and I had performances lined up and I was super, super busy. And then like the pandemic happened, the shutdown happened. And so like within like a week, like all of my gigs were like wiped out of my calendar. I was like, oh man, this sucks. This is devastating. So it was like a crazy time for like a lot of people. And so the only thing like coming in was the sheet music business. I was like, okay, I'm just going to put all my energy into that. And then also too, I realized a lot of people were like hurting because like, I had lost a whole bunch of my gigs and everybody else had. And so I made a certain portion of my catalog. I had like some free pieces and I was like, hey, I know a lot of you are doing recording because that was like an uptick of like people like recording with themselves and multi-tracks and stuff. And so I was like, hey, here's some free music. And because like other like retailers were just like responding as a corporation and stuff like that. And so like I was just like, I'm going to respond as a human. And so I think like that response, people are like, hey, that helped build out the connection there. And so the business was able to kind of sustain itself and float through that time. And then a lot of people right around like June of 2020, that's when things were like super crazy in the States, where we had like George Floyd's murder and then we still had like COVID going on. It was like really bad. And so a lot of people were reaching out because there was all these conversations about lack of diversity, especially in like the classical world. And so being like a Black musician, I was like very aware of that. And so like a lot of people are like, hey, could you give me information about Black composers in the past and present? And so I found myself sharing like 5 or 6 different websites, like, oh, check this out, check this out, check this out. I'm like, well, this is crazy. There should just be like one website, not like 5 or 6 of them. And so I was like, someone should create that. And I was like, oh, maybe it could be me. And so I was like trying to like think about like, oh, well, maybe I'll make a WordPress site or maybe like one of the site builders. Or I was like, maybe I'll learn how to code because I thought about like games that the site could have and stuff like that. And so that's when I entertained the idea of like, maybe I could code it myself. So I like Googled like how to code a website.
Oh my God.
And so I started learning like HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And
just
like,
from Google.
Yeah, I just like Googling it. Yeah. And then I found this like class that like started teaching that. And I was like, okay, I'll just go through the class. And then I found this group that's called Free Code Camp. It's a nonprofit organization, which is where I work now. And so I started taking their courses. And then I, learned enough to build the site that I was interested in. So I called it the Black Excellence Music Project. It has like profiles of different musicians from past and present and games and stuff like that. And then there was like a little video YouTube series that I created for that. And so I had so much fun creating that I was like, well, maybe I want to code some more. And so like that first year of like learning how to code, I like bounced back and forth between like, do I want to go back to performing full time or do I want to do this coding thing? The coding thing sounds kind of fun. And so that's when I finally decided like, yeah, I want to actually do this full time. And so that's when I got like super serious about like, okay, what do I need to learn to like be job ready and stuff. And then early 2022 was when because I had done like some small contract work too, with freelancing software and stuff. But then my first like full-time job was early 2022. That's when I landed my first full-time role, working at a JavaScript, mainly a company doing like web development development applications with JavaScript, and that was my first like full-time thing. So I had like completely transitioned there. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. How did you get yourself job ready? Did you have to go back and study in any formal capacity in this area or take other kinds of classes?
Yeah. So I had done like a whole bunch of research and saying like, okay, what do I need to know? Like, do I need to go back to college? Is that like even a feasible option at this point? And I learned that like, no, you didn't. You just had to like learn the core of like web development and stuff like that. And so I just sought out like the areas that I still needed to learn and kind of filled in those gaps and found the courses. And all that time, like I was like networking online because we were just coming out of the pandemic, started to kind of get back into person. But I was doing a whole bunch of networking online, just like learning in different communities because I just wanted to know like, am I on the right track? Am I doing the right thing and learning? So I took a whole bunch of courses. I was building a whole bunch of stuff. And then I was going to this Women in Tech meetup that met up like once a month online, and the group, the company that was sponsoring that was the company I ended up working for, and so they had some openings there for a junior developer, and I was like, oh, I'm a junior developer, like I want to apply, and so I decided to apply, and I went through the whole interview process and stuff like that, and then I got an offer, and I was like, cool, and so I took the offer and started working full time. So. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I just keep thinking back to what Danny told you at Eastman when he was like, oh, just start it now. Just start your business now, figure it out as you go, and see what happens. And it seems like there's been all of these different pivot points in your career pathway so far. And every time you've just started anyways, even if you didn't feel quite prepared. So with the sheet music business, and then even with coding and, saying, oh, there's a need for this website. Why don't I fill it? What do I need to do to fill it, and figuring it out as you go. And I think that's really encouraging for people to just be able to see that you can start over essentially a lot of times and still make it work. It feels like you've started over a number of times. From moving from California to the East Coast, and then starting freelancing in Michigan, and then restarting again in California, and then restarting a whole new career in software engineering. And it's really inspiring to be able to see that you can keep bringing that grind and bringing the networking and the connections and making it work and figuring it out as you go.
Yeah. I mean, if you had asked me when I was like 15, if I was going to be a software developer, I'd be like, no, But like now, it's just like it's crazy how like life, went in that direction there. So, yeah.
Do you feel like there are aspects from all of that musical training and background that come into play in your software developing career?
Yeah, I actually like wrote an article about like the parallels between like studying music and studying software.
How cool.
And so I wrote it like a couple of years ago. But yeah, I think like one of the key things is just like all those years in the practice room, because I remember like Dr. Scatterday would always say like the ones that are the best players, they keep practicing until like they get it, nail it. They don't just kind of practice what they already know. They practice what they don't know and get it better and stuff. And so I remember Stu Kilmer would always say, like, you practice it until you can't get it wrong. Like, you can't, like, make a mistake even if you tried. And so that type of discipline is needed in software engineering, because there's going to be times where you just need to learn certain aspects of how things work. And you can't just, like, walk away from it where it's like, oh, this is hard, Like, I don't want to learn this stuff. Like, you have to make sure you have those skills in you. It's one of those things because technology keeps changing. And so it's one of those things you have to just keep learning and growing. And so there's times where you have to sit down and learn the not so fun parts and aspects of it, where it's like, oh, this isn't as fun. And learning, especially when it comes to like the theory and stuff like that. And so there's like a tendency when people are teaching themselves like, oh, well, this theory part isn't as fun, I'm just gonna like leave it to the side. But I think I just always drew from like the times in the practice room where it's like, no, we gotta sit down and like practice this passage, we gotta play this thing. And so I can't just walk away from it because this passage is hard. Like, I gotta like sit down and like learn it, And so I just brought that into learning how to code and continuing to learn and grow my skills there.
Yeah, and I think the idea of the practice room coming out in all these different aspects, and I feel like I see just such a grind in all of these phases of your life, and I feel like that could have even just started in the practice room, like you were saying, spending that dedicated time every day, honing your craft, and then bringing that outside to honing your craft in all of these different aspects of life and these different pathways that you've gone down and shifted through. How does music play a role in your life now? Are you playing oboe? What about your sheet music business? How does that work with your software developing career?
Yeah. So I've now worked for like a few different companies, but now I just like mainly do full-time software development, and then I just kind of play occasionally on the side. So I still practice just like for myself now, and so I'll just pick little pieces and stuff. And occasionally, if I get a call where it's like, "Hey Jess, we need a player, an oboe player here," I'm like, "Okay, cool, yeah, I'm free." But very rarely do I like perform outside of like my living room and stuff like that. So sometimes now it's just like fun pieces that I wanted to play, so fun solo pieces that I just kind of learn for myself, and concertos that I relearn or something like that and revisit from my college days. So just kind of having fun. So I still like practice on occasion, but like nothing to like be like, oh, I'm gonna give a recital. So it's just like I just want to learn this solo, or I just want to learn this piece. So,
yeah. Do you miss the freelance lifestyle of your professional oboe career phase of life? And do you ever wish that you had majored in something more related on paper, maybe, to what you're doing now?
Yeah. I think about like if I went back in time and I did like a computer science major, I don't think I would have liked it because like I think it would have moved too fast for me personally, and it's just like very theory heavy. And so like I like taking computer science classes, but at my own pace, because a lot of it, especially when it comes to like discrete mathematics and stuff like that, where I'm like, okay, I need to take a minute to like absorb like all these different like like theory and algorithms and stuff like that. And so I think if I went through a computer science like the traditional route, it probably would have just moved too quickly for me. I probably would have dropped out and like resented it or something. And so for me, I learned that like self-learning works really well because I can just learn at a slower pace and absorb the material a little bit better. And so I'm going to still continue to take computer science classes online and whatnot throughout my career. But yeah, I think if I had to go back, I probably would have still just done the music major, because one of the things too, people are like, oh, are you going to do like a music ed major? But I knew I didn't want to be a band director and stuff like that, and so I probably would have still stuck with music performance there.
Yeah, and I just asked because I just think it's interesting to think back, and it's nice that you know yourself well enough to imagine that actually I don't think that course would have worked well for me, and obviously it worked out the way it was meant to work out. And I love that you can find all these parallels of all of that background and training and seeing how they relate to what you're doing now, enough to even write a whole article about it, which is really cool. And I think it's also nice just that music is still part of your life, that you're able to practice. Do you find it hard to pick the oboe back up? Because I feel like for wind instruments, I find as a clarinetist, there's maintenance and consistency that's needed for those kinds of instruments, maybe more than some others. How do you find, if you're taking a long period off from oboe, coming back to it?
Yeah. So when I started working full time back in 2022, I did take a little bit of a break because I was getting adjusted to working full time as a developer, and so I didn't practice for like months. And then when I came back into it, I was like, oh, I'm a little rusty there. I didn't have like the same stamina, so I definitely felt it, and so I had to like kind of get back into it. So now I'm in a regular where I practice pretty much every single day, and so still just kind of like practicing small little things that I just like to practice. But yeah, when I took that break, I was just like, oh man, kind of coming back into it. I'm like, I don't have the same stamina. You got to like work your way back up to that there. So yeah.
Yeah. It's cool to hear you talk about these different pieces and just how much you like them. So you're talking now about practice, and you're like, I practice every day because I like just things that I like, or when you got into coding, you liked it so much. You're like, oh, could I do this more? Or the sheet music business, you enjoyed arranging so much. And I think it's really special that you're able to involve all of these different things that you enjoy, all of these different parts of who you are in your different phases of your career, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, everything just ends up being interconnected, even the education portion, because where I'm working now, I'm doing a lot of like teaching and stuff like that with like programming as well as developing. So it's nice, like a nice mixture of like not only just, coding things out, but then also the teaching component. So everything kind of comes, I guess, full circle there.
That's cool. I really appreciate you just taking us through all of the twists and turns of your journey. It's so interesting. And part of why I wanted to do this podcast was just to showcase how there's so many different pathways that musicians can take with their careers. And I feel like yours showcases a whole bunch of them in one story. So it's really, really cool to see. I always end my episodes with a quick rapid fire question and answer section. So just how you're feeling today, top of mind.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Cool. So who is your favorite composer?
I feel like this like changes a lot, but right now, Debussy. I think I always circle back to Debussy, and I took a lot of classes at Debussy in grad school. Yeah. So it's probably going to be Debussy there.
Great.
Yeah.
How about your favorite piece of classical music?
Okay, I'll name a few if that's okay.
Oh yeah, please.
So I think one of them, probably still to this day, would be the Organ Symphony by Saint-Saëns, and I think just especially that second movement, so beautiful, so gorgeous. Shostakovich 5, that was like actually the first piece that I heard in Eastman Theater when the orchestra was playing that. What's some other ones there? In terms of, I guess, oboe pieces, I like listening to the Strauss Oboe Concerto. I don't like playing it as much.
Yeah, fair.
It's just like this marathon of a piece, and so I love listening to it. And then a lot of English music, and so Gordon Jacobs and stuff like that. Yeah.
Cool. How about your favorite movie soundtrack?
Oh boy, this one's actually interesting. It would have to actually be Hook. And like I know a lot of people either like love the movie or hate the movie, but I really love the soundtrack, and I love the movie too, even though it's like a lot longer than it needs to be. But I do love the soundtrack there, and so
Okay, I actually haven't seen it, so I'm gonna add that to my watch list.
So it's John Williams and so you can't go wrong with John Williams there. But yeah, the movie's a little bit on the long side, but I still like it, and it's got Robin Williams in it, so you can't go wrong with that either.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm used to long movies, having love Lord of the Rings. We just saw Dune 2 the other day. That one's pretty long, so long movies are good if they're enjoyable, I think.
I like it, so hopefully you like it too.
I'll check it out. What's a book that you keep coming back to, so either you reread it or it's just something that's stuck with you?
One book that I've read a couple of times is Richard Branson's autobiography, because he has a wild, crazy life. And so I always keep coming back. I read his book I think years ago, like 2015 or 2014, and then I read it again and a few years later. So I always kind of circle back to that, because it's his life. That one and Phil Knight's of Nike, his autobiography. So I really like interesting autobiographies. And also Bad Blood. I've read that a couple of times. The one about the Theranos scandal.
Gotcha.
so those are some of the books that I reread and keep coming back to.
Cool. How about a musician you really admire and why?
Oh boy, that's tough to nail down to one.
Of course.
Who I really admire is Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh.
Every single time, she just had what a talent, but she just had so much personality and just kind of off the cuff too, could just improvise and play off of the audience.
Yes.
I remember hearing this live recording where she was doing a Tisket a Tasket. And you could tell that she was just feeding off of the audience's energy, and they were kind of jabbing with her, and then she would kind of play off of that and jab back with them. And so I just love how she was able to slip into that and inject that into her performance. And so I think she was just a legend there.
Amazing. What would you say is the most useful app on your phone?
Oh, useful. I think when I was a musician, probably would have been the metronome and tuner apps. But now, maybe my Slack app, because I'm Yeah, I'm always like, I always have these, like, I have Google Messenger, Google Chat, and Slack open. And so those are probably the most useful now that I work in software. And so I just always have those, and I have like notifications on and stuff like that. And so, yeah, those are probably the more useful ones now.
Yeah. And this is just an off the cuff question, but if somebody was interested in getting started in coding, is there a particular resource that you found helpful when you were starting?
Yeah. So I'm going to pitch where I work now, which is free Code Camp. And so that's actually where because I had taken a couple of courses and then I found Free Code Camp, which is an online interactive curriculum, and which one of the reasons why I really liked it was because it married the theory and practice. And so that's what you need a lot when you're first learning how to code, is just a lot of practice. And so I liked how you can just go through the different challenges and projects. And so now I'm working on the team that's building out the interactive project-based curriculums and helping building out the website and stuff like that. And so it's kind of cool to be on the other side of that.
Yeah, really cool. Do you find any parallels between how you approached practicing music to practicing coding?
Yeah. I think for me, like, repetition was key, and I did that a lot when I was practicing, where you just sit in the practice room and be like, all right, I'm going to practice these few lines, like, or measures over and over again at a nice slow tempo, and then you kind of work your way up. And so there's a lot of parallels with that, where you're just like, I need to practice these types of concepts. And one of the things I think that worked for me was like building out little like exercises for myself and be like, oh, okay, I just learned about, this concept. And so now I'm going to try to build out this using that concept. And now I'm learning about this concept, so I'm going to try to build something small. And it was something like, 20 lines of code or something. It wasn't like this massive application, but it was something for me to like keep coming back to and practicing with different exercises that helped solidify it to me. And so that was kind of like a parallel to when you go in the practice room and you like practice practice those exercises or etudes or whatever your teacher would give you there. So,
That's cool. And then finally, if there was one resource that you feel someone would really benefit from, could be a book, a movie, podcast, anything that you just think someone should check out.
That's a good question. There was one that I really liked. I don't know if he's still active on YouTube, but Evan Carmichael, he has a lot of like positivity, but it's not like toxic positivity. It's like he does a lot of videos. He has like a series called Top 10, where he like compiles like different clips from entrepreneurs and leaders and stuff like that from past and present, and he takes out like top 10 lessons that they've learned along the way. And I used to watch a lot of those videos, so that's on YouTube. And then he has like some other content too, but his top 10 series is like really uplifting. Usually they're pretty short, it's like 20 minutes or something like that. So yeah.
Amazing. That sounds really interesting. I'll have to check that one out too. Yeah. Well, again, really appreciate you coming on the podcast and just your willingness to share your journey. I have found it really, really fascinating just to hear about how you've navigated it and all of the parallels between what could seemingly appear as very different worlds, music and software development, but actually there's so many parallels that can be found, and I find that really interesting. I'm sure others will too, and just be inspired by how you've been able to build all these different careers for yourself and get to where you are now. So really appreciate you coming on. And if you could just end with, if there's a final piece of advice that you would want to leave with listeners, and then also how can people connect with you, the work that you're doing now, if your sheet music business is still ongoing, things like that, how could people find you?
Yeah. I'm pretty active on Twitter, which is interesting because like I wasn't really that active on Twitter, but I was a musician. But like the tech scene, like there's a lot of people you gotta be. And so I'm Coder Girl 1991 on Twitter. So you can find me there, just like posting and stuff like that. You can reach out and DM me there. But then also I'm not really that active on like Facebook as much anymore, or Instagram there.
There's so many platforms.
Yeah. So I'm mainly like active on Twitter there. And then I still have JDW Sheet Music just kind of running back as a hobby. And everything is digital download. And so people can like, browse the site and then just have it be, once they purchase it, just be a digital download, and then that's done. And so that helps open up to the international audience. So we did that a few years back, opening that up. And so, that's pretty much where I'm at online there.
Cool. And then if there was just a final piece of advice,
that's right. Yeah, I would just say, I guess, like, just do it. I think that was kind of like, that's like the common theme in my story of like, even if you don't feel ready, like I definitely didn't feel ready when I had like my first, full-time software developer job, because I was like, oh, I don't have a computer science degree and all this other stuff. But if you're willing to put the work in and you're willing to learn and grow and ask questions and get better, then it's all going to work itself out there. So yeah, just go for it, even if you don't feel ready there.
I love it. Thank you so much, Jessica. And yeah, wishing you the best of luck with everything you're doing.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Orchestrating Your Career podcast, and a big thank you to Jessica for sharing all the twists and turns of her personal journey. If you enjoyed the episode, then give this video a like and leave a comment below about what you took away from Jessica's story. If you're listening on Spotify, it would also be a huge help if you could leave the podcast a review. The resources mentioned in this episode and where you can connect with Jessica are all linked below. You can find the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms, as well as get more frequent updates on Instagram. To watch videos of all the episodes and get extra behind-the-scenes content, check out the YouTube channel Orchestrating Your Career. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. Share this episode with a musician or anyone else you think might be interested, and look out for new episodes twice a month. Next episode's conversation will be with Weijun Chen, a composer who got his bachelor's from the Eastman School of Music and his PhD from the University at Buffalo. He is now a composer of film, TV, and video games based in Los Angeles. Stay tuned to hear his story. Until then, please enjoy this English horn solo. So Jessica, take it away.